Does every gnome need blocking? No. This gnome was not blocked. This gnome was not blocked. This one was. So I don't believe that every pattern needs to be blocked, because a simply knit gnome doesn't have a lot of yarn acrobatics that requires the attention of moisture to relax it. These gnomes look great. They're simple, they are fine. However, gnomes with color work or cables will probably benefit a lot from being blocked. And blocking on the needles is a little spooky, because the thing is when a gnome is stuffed, blocking it's a little tricky because of the way that the stuffing can take so long to dry, and we don't want that. So how do we block it? We block it on the needles, usually just before stuffing, and I want to demystify what that would look like. So a gnome with cables would be blocked, a gnome with color work would be blocked. And what blocking means in this case is not, if you've ever seen laced blocking tutorials where we get something wet and then we pin it out and we open things up. Blocking doesn't mean opening up. Blocking means allowing the yarn and some moisture to just kind of settle in and get all relaxed and comfortable. And the stitches get to say, hey, do I have enough yarn? Do you need a little more? Or hey, if I move over here, we'd all look a little smoother. Blocking is really about moisture and just settling in. And if a gnome is plain, settling in means settling into plain, just being hanging out and looking good. Whereas if a gnome has some yarn doing some acrobatics, you may find tension or other things just settle in. There are two ways to block on the needles, or off the needles if you are doing that as well. One is steaming and the other is immersing it into water. So we're going to talk about both of those. There are two reasons why I'd steam block. One, I'm not sure that the yarn won't bleed. Let's say you're doing a color work gnome and one is purple and the other color is white, and you haven't tested them in your water to see if your pH or whatever is working will go together and make them bleed. And then you'd have like a lilac gnome with a darker purple color work, and you'd be sad. So steam in that case. Or steam when you're in a rush, because it's really fast, it dries really, really quickly. I tend to steam block because I want my gnomes. So let's talk about steam blocking. Put my bowl of water off to the side here. I don't have a steamer, I just have an iron. My iron has a button that makes steam puff really fast. So that's what I do. I first set it all the way to the highest setting, and I put some water into the reservoir, and then I need something for safety because steam can burn. So what I do is I take a tea towel or face cloth or something like that, and I fold it up and I roll it. And then we're gonna insert that into the gnome so that we have a bit of a handle. All right, so if I were to place this in my gnome, what's going to do is it's going to, and I'm not stuffing this like I want it to be perfect in terms of, oh, you know, every little bit is full, because obviously there's no way it's gonna get up to the tip. I have seen a lot of people, especially for gnomes like this, where they're really wanting it to like be able to be like crisp and perfect. Some people will create a cone out of cardboard and cover it with some kind of plastic wrap or something like that, and then the gnome dries really nicely on that. And you could use that possibly for steaming too, although I'd be checking that plastic to see what happened. So by doing this, I've done two things. Number one, I've made it so that the gnome isn't flat anywhere. Anywhere there's a flat place on the gnome, if it dries like that, that's basically you're putting a crease into it. You're blocking that gnome to have a bit of a crease, which we don't usually want. So I've kind of made this round, and I've also given myself a place to hold it away from the steam. If you have metal needles, you don't need to worry about steaming the metal needles. But if you have wood or bamboo or something like that, you either want to put the gnome onto a needle, like a corded a long circular, or just thread it on some scrap yarn. That is another thing that can happen. Although depending on how you hold the steam, you don't need to worry too much about bamboo or wood needles. It's all a question of proportion and amount that you intend to be getting this wet. So this would look something like this. I would hold it and I would simply puff close to it and rotate it a few times until it looks like everything's kind of settled and relaxed. So it would look like this. make sure that the gnome looks the way I want it to, because as it's drying, that's the shape it's going to take. So if there were any bumps because of the tea towel or something, I would kind of make sure that wasn't happening. If I want this to bend over and dry like that, I might do that while it's drying. But steaming, the drying happens really, really quickly, which, as I said, is one reason why I love it so much. Now, let's say you're not in the mood to steam block. Well, you'll still need a tea towel. So hang in there. Just like with steaming, depending on the needle type, you might want to thread this onto scrap yarn or another long circular, so that you're not worried about what the water might do to your needles. Because really, we are just going to be dunking this gnome. So I like to get a bowl, we put the gnome in, and I push it in. I'm using a very small bowl so that this is easy to see, but I'm hoping that it's pretty obvious. We're really just getting this gnome wet. The trick is about not how to get a gnome wet, but how to get it dry afterwards. So normally I'd let this sit for 5 minutes. I would get distracted, I'd come back, and it'd be like half an hour. That's really how blocking happens in my life. So let's say it's sat for a while, everything has gotten thoroughly wet. Then what I like to do is I like to pull it out. Whenever yarn is wet, especially wool and silk, you want to support the weight. Any wet wool is heavy and you don't want it stretching and distorting. So support the gnome as you pull it out. And then, oh, I should pull my sleeves back. You want to squeeze as much water as possible out, but no wringing, no sideways motion. Wool is delicate when it's wet. So you want to just squeeze water out. Then you're going to want a towel. We're going to have to use our imaginations, because I always use my feet for this step. So here we are, we've got our gnome, we're rolling it inside a towel. When you do this, make sure that you're not stepping on the ends of the needles. And then I would place weight on it. And you want to get as much moisture out as possible. Is that necessary? No, everything will dry eventually, but most of us don't want to wait too long for our gnomes to dry, and the drier you make it before you start the drying process, the better. So normally, like I said, I would stand on this, and I would, sort of use both feet, and I'd step around, so you're just gonna have to imagine that I've stood on this. This office is not big enough for me to, I tried one shot already. I've already filmed this video, and my face did not appear above my nostrils, which was sad. So again, you can squeeze and put pressure, but you cannot wring. Depending on your house, you will either want a new towel that is dry, or maybe you have a dryer, like a heating vent. You can put it over there. It's up to you. Or if you have a radiator, you might be able to rest it on the radiator. But what you want to do is you want to have some place that it can dry on, and you want it not to dry flat. And you have a couple of options here. If you were to dry it just like this edge and this edge would be very creased, as though you'd taken paper and folded it. And if that bothers you, when it does most people, there are a couple options. One, just before it's dry, like once it starts being about 75% dry, start coming in and moving it every half hour to hour, and just kind of shift that point so that that crease point doesn't set in really firmly. The other thing you can do is forget completely about it, come back, realize that it's all creased, and kind of get it cranky. I would stuff the gnome, and then I would steam it. Or I would spritz it a little bit with a water bottle and just kind of get that section to relax. Gnomes are pretty easygoing. But to prevent that, my favorite technique is just to take something and I insert it in, and I do not stuff it to size. I am not looking for something to go in there that is the same diameter. What I'm looking for is something that's smaller and keeps it from getting completely flat so that it creases. As long as it's kind of like this, that edge, that angle isn't going to be creased. So it's okay if the shape I create is more like a football or a rugby ball than a soccer ball. The stuffing process at the end is going to do a lot for the final shaping. So I put a tea towel smaller than the circumference of the gnome. I'm hoping you can see that it's quite a lot smaller, and I just place it up in there The trick is to not do something where you kind of block it and there's a ridge. So for this gnome, for instance, I might not use a tea towel, I might use a washcloth and roll it so that it tapers a bit or something like that. But like I said, what I'm looking for is I'm looking for a shape that keeps it from drying like creased. So this I'm doing a very bad job of showing, but I'm just looking for something that would go up high enough to keep the edges from becoming creased. I would ideally go and get something else. And can you see that my stitches just came off my needle? Goodness gracious me. Don't panic. As long as you don't panic and pull sideways, the stitches are just going to hang out there. It's only when you move the knitting sideways that the stitches get small and go down. So you just move slowly and patiently and breathing, and you just put the needles back in. There we are. So I will find a better towel that actually works and as I described, and I'm going to let this dry. Blocking a gnome, not always necessary, and when there it is, you have two options. You can steam it, you can soak it. Let it dry in a shape that's pretty reasonable, and don't forget that stuffing is still yet to happen, and you can always give it a bit of a steam or a bit of a spritz once it's stuffed. I hope this helped you.